Welcome to Casted, a popular science podcast from IT University of Copenhagen, where we want to talk about issues related to the foundations of information technology. My name is Tore Husfeldt, I'm your host. And when I just said information technology, it's not actually really clear what we mean by this. So this is only our third episode, and we are still currently focusing a lot on the technical details and administrative details and learning the ropes. I think that's getting better and better. However, we also really want to think about what kind of topics, domains and epistemologies and disciplines are a valid domain for discourse in this. So the first two episodes, I made my life very easy. I was very much inside my comfort zone. First two episodes were me, an algorithm theorist, talking to other algorithm theorists about artificial intelligence. So that was very much our comfort zone, and I think there is easily enough material for 12 or 24 episodes like that, but then we're at the danger of digging ourselves into some kind of hole. So the best person to prevent us from actually digging ourselves into a hole is the man who actually wrote a book about bursting these kinds of information bubbles. Our guest today is Vincent Hendricks from University of Copenhagen. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for having me.
So Vincent, you are a philosopher. You did actually publish about artificial intelligence at the beginning. But today you're leading the Center for Bubble Studies at Copenhagen University. So tell us a bit about that.
So I'm a professor of formal philosophy, so that basically means that I am a computer scientist in disguise. I did my PhD at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh on formal learning theory. And one of the things I was studying there was the exchange of information when you combine what's called epistemic logic and learning theory. And that led me to a lot of issues about proving convergent theorems for these particular kinds of logics.
Can you unpack that already? Because there are lots of words here. Is there informal philosophy?
Well, I mean, no, there's no such thing as, I guess you could say there's something called informal and formal philosophy, but when you talk about formal philosophy, really what you're saying is that it's all the places in philosophy in which math or some other technical toolbox will have a grasp. Now that's a lot of places, so that could be from epistemology to philosophy of science. Say.
And there's logic in there?
And there's logic. I'm basically a logician.
You're a logician,
right. So that's basically a logician by training. And on the sort of narrow understanding of what logic is, it's the study of valid inferences. But if you look at it in a more broad, modern perspective, really what logic is the science of correct information processing. And for that matter, also incorrect information processing. So you take logic to be a much broader term now than what it probably used to be reserved for. Now, one of the things I've been looking at is basically how information exchanges between agents, whether they're computers on one end or humans on the other, will actually get you to have knowledge or not. And so I was proving convergence theorems for various logics that had to do with agents learning new information and when they could make conclusions. So that was basically it. Now, that I've been doing for maybe 20 years by now. And then more recently, I've become interested on the intersection between economics and philosophy or logic. And one of the places where they obviously meet is when you look at information that investors have pertaining to investing their liquid means in various assets. And usually when we think about that, we think about monetary assets. So that would be stock, real estate, and options or other fantasias of financial products, one way or the other, that we have seen. Now, and one of the things you get out of that is that you could create bubbles. So we have had a real estate bubble, right?
So there are many versions of the word bubble here, right? There's the
I'll get to. Let's take the canonical version first. The canonical version of a bubble first is a situation in which assets, real estate or stock, what have you, trade at prices systematically that far exceeds the fundamental value of the asset.
Housing would be another example.
Housing would be another example.
Bitcoin is probably an example. We don't know whether it's bursting or not.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So that's the understanding that you have standardly of what a bubble is.
So it's not already part of economics. My knowledge of economics is very little.
Yes.
So there is already a framework in existence where you can talk about the value of something,
certainly,
even though the value is just socially constructed by some kind of...
At least we take there to be such a thing as a fundamental value to the asset. Now we could disagree and agree or disagree about exactly how do you define that, but that's also an issue for economists worrying about it now. But suppose there is such a thing as a fundamental value to the asset, can you overheat it? And yes, we have seen that. And economics have a discipline, or a number of disciplines, actually looking at bubbles. And the reason why that's interesting is because if you ask a historian of economics as to how many financial bubbles there have been, then they're actually pretty specific about it. So one of the first documented real bubbles was from 1637 to be exact, the Dutch tulip frenzy.
Oh, that I know about. Oh, that's a great example. Tell us about that. So, I love that. Yes.
Okay, so the Dutch tulip frenzy in 1637, or around that time, was basically that all of a sudden everybody wanted to have tulip bulbs. And that was, of course, because that Holland had been a big merchant nation, and so they were getting into the country, and all of a sudden the value of these assets rise until sometime in March 1637, where one tulip bulb, just one of them, adjusted for inflation and modern currency, would cost you about $1 million a piece for
Very
one
nice.
bulb.
And
they traded like 10 times a day, right? So they shipped it 10 times a day.
And the operational value of tulips had actually not changed by this, because you can't really use them for anything else than making your wife happy or putting them on a grave or
or putting them in big gardens and whatnot.
Yes,
right? So there was a use for them, but it far exceeded what they were actually traded for. So that entire frenzy just burst, and the market crashed, and people lost a lot of money. That's usually what happens. And since then, there have been, if you ask a historian of economics, between 25 and 30 bubbles up until today, because there's a set of conditions that have to be met before you have a bubble. It's not like some asset trade that are far exceeding a value just once. It has to be systemically, and there's actually a canonical developmental trajectory for many of these bubbles. They sort of follow the same pattern.
I see.
And the interesting thing about that pattern is that you can it usually is also divided into different phases. So there is a frenzy usually starts by some investor or a set of investors going, there might be something to this asset, whether it's stock or real estate or what have you, tulip bubbles or whatnot. And then they start investing. And those are called the smart money. They know what the value of the asset is. They can also make rational predictions as to what they can sell it for later. And so they're what's called well-informed traders. They start buying this asset. And all of a sudden, slowly but surely, the valuation of the asset goes above what it's actually worth. And what happens then is usually that what we call institutional investors, so that could be mortgage funds, it could be credit unions, it could be banks, it could be others, actually jump this bandwagon also. Once they jump this bandwagon, because they have a lot of liquid means to invest with, and so they start investing. And sometimes some of the smart money will actually then, okay, the dividend is big enough. I made my margin. I'm going to sell off. Then you get this little bear trap where the valuation of the actually drops a little bit.
Oh, because the first group moves out of the...
Yeah, because the smart money sort of pulled out, right? And then what happens usually is that what you get is then that you're going to need some new investors to get into the market. And these kind of new investors cannot be the same smart money again. And so what usually happens is that the media gets into it and starts saying, you got to buy this. And then you get traders in who believe that they know what the value of the asset is, but they really don't. So they're called noise traders. And that means laymen usually, right?
Yes.
Once laymen get into the market, then all of a sudden the frenzy really starts, and greed and enthusiasm and whatnot. And then you get this usually sort of exponential setting of the valuation of the asset relative to the fundamental value. So it's being traded for a lot more than what it's worth. Then you get this newer paradigm that just couldn't go wrong, and then eventually the market crashes. You get a bull trap, and then the market crashes. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that there is a discrepancy between well-informed traders and not so well-informed traders, right? And sometimes you can even get a rational investor to say, or a smart money could actually re-enter the market. And he will re-enter the market. It might even be rational for him to do so, under the assumption that there is a greater fool out there that will take off his asset later. Then he's going to make the dividend in between. He
might earn some social capital also by just being part of this. So that may be worth something.
That might be worth something, but usually he's just in it for the money.
Yes.
And no, basically, so a rational agent might actually entertain the idea of getting back into the market under the assumption that there's a greater fool out there that will take it off his hands. Nice. And that's called the greater fool theory for bubble formation.
The greater what?
The greater fool theory.
The greater fool theory. Right?
Nice. So you have a rational investor, he'll re-enter the market only under the assumption, and it's rational for him to do so, assuming there's a greater fool out there that will take it off. All right. Now, An interesting thing about all this is that whether you enter or not enter the market is acutely sensitive to what sort of information you have available.
Because that's where we actually want to go. This is all has to be about information.
That's right. So basically, that's the reason why I dubbed the Center for Information and Bubble Studies. Because information is key when you have to invest.
Yes.
And we can actually find bubbles in other markets than financial markets because it's a matter of what sort of information is available. So let me give you a couple of examples on that. Now, we are assuming that the liquid means that we are talking about is
money.
And the kind of money that we are talking about is either cash money or credit or debt.
Right.
All right. So during the subprime crisis in the U.S., a lot of the crisis was actually a result of fact people packing debt in different ways and selling that off.
Yes.
And so debt is actually a very liquid mean, surprisingly enough, but it actually is. Now, think about you as an investor on social media, say. Every upvote, every like, every comment, every selfie, every emoji that you place on a post, or every retweet that you make on Twitter could actually be understood as your opinion investment.
As a liquid mean now.
Well, yeah, so upvotes, likes, comments, selfies, all the gestures that we have on, say, social media platforms are actually liquid means that you could use to invest your opinion in a blog post that you find interesting, in a retweet or in a tweet that you will retweet, in a Facebook posting that you'll upvote, in a YouTube video that you will downvote, and so forth.
So help me think about this. So when I want to buy an expensive tulip, I actually have to pay money.
Yeah.
But when I take selfies, that doesn't really take a lot of my own assets away from me, right?
Right.
So it must be some kind of other capital I'm investing.
Because the only asset that everybody is after on social media and in the information age is other people's attention.
Other people's attention.
Yes,
not my own. I see.
That's right.
Ah.
And so
Okay.
already back in 1971, Nobel Prize laureate Herbert Simon,
Yes.
psychologist, who's been extremely influential in artificial intelligence
Yes,
and information
absolutely.
theory and elsewhere, said that, or projected, or already came up with the idea that if attention is an asset, then how do you allocate people's attention? Well, you get them to consume information, right? Because when you consume information, your attention is allocated, right?
Yes.
Okay, so that means all of a sudden that information is a very, very, very important commodity because you use that to allocate other people's attention. Now, if you look at the way in which social media platforms are working, what they want is to allocate people's attention. They use information to do that. Information generates traffic. Traffic is money, influence, power, respect, what have you. So the more information that you can allocate, or actually the more attention you can allocate using information, then all of a sudden you're turning information into a very, very, very valuable commodity. And since attention is scarce, because there's only that much attention that you can allocate, there's only 24 hours in a day, and you can only do more or less one thing at once, then once you allocate it, you got it. So the question is, how do you use information to allocate people's attention? And by allocating people's attention, you are generating everything from traffic, and traffic in and by itself on social media, say, is equal to money, and if you're doing it in politics, political capital, and if you're doing it in status, then status economics, et cetera, et cetera. So basically in the information age, information is extremely valuable because you can use it to allocate other people's attention, and other people's attention in the end is traffic, and traffic is influence, power, money, et cetera, et cetera. So that means, would there be investors out there, or traders in information, or attention merchants, if you wish, who could actually speculate as to what sort of information people are willing to consume, and in the meantime, you get their attention? Are there such things? Yes. And the answer is obviously yes. That seems to be in much a way the currency of the Trump campaign, was to allocate people's attention by feeding them information that took up their attention independently of whether that information is true. And so here's the issue in the information age. Whatever is viral is not necessarily true, and whatever is true is not necessarily viral. Now, if you're just a little bit of an enlightenment person, that would be disconcerting to you, right? The information, to put it another way, truth is not necessarily viral.
No,
but fake news might be.
But that's not new, right? Help me understand how does this seems to have always been true. That truth is not necessarily viral.
Right.
It has other qualities that inside certain frameworks of discourse, truth seems to have some positive. I mean, it seems to survive very well inside physics, for instance, right? But it's not very interesting for buying tulips. So, but help me understand what is new here about the information society or the digital society.
Everybody has more or less access now. So everybody has a bullhorn to the world. That's a new thing. We haven't seen that one before. Usually, enlightening, or for that matter, also discrediting the public with information has been something that established media had the monopoly on. Now everybody has a profile online, they have access to information online, et cetera, and all of a sudden, everybody has access to allocating other people's attention using information. Oh, and by the way, at light speed and potentially globally. And that's exactly the reason why the World Economic Forum in 2016 took massive digital misinformation as a global challenge on par with food security, climate change, and a host of other global challenges. Now misinformation is actually being counted as a global challenge because it can be used for cyber attacks, it could be used for terrorism, and as they say, it's a threat to the failure of global governance. And
good. So there are many things here that I really want to talk about because I'm fetishizing the Enlightenment as much as you probably are. So we are on the same side here, epistemologically and probably ideologically. So again, I think you said it already, but let's say it again slowly. So the new thing is not the existence of misinformation,
all the time.
nor the ease with which certain agents are able to perpetuate, spread, or fabricate misinformation.
Well, I mean, I think it's fair to say that a lot more people now have access to the information superhighways ever since we got everything from the internet to social media, right? Because before, there was at least a tendency for the fact that although, of course, you could spread information, you was going to have to you would have to write a column for a paper, and then somebody would have to, either disagree or disagree.
Yeah, but once I have that column, or once I mean, both Hitler and Churchill understood the power of having the monopoly on the radio.
Absolutely.
because that was a brilliant example of a one-way communication that was very tightly controlled, which could be used both for information and misinformation.
Yeah, and that's what they did.
Yes.
But now, of course, there's a lot more merchants out there. You are in principle a merchant too.
Exactly. That must be the new thing.
That's the new
everybody
thing.
is now a merchant.
Everybody has access. Everybody has a bullhorn to the world. Everybody is an attention merchant potentially.
But that potentially might actually be better than what we had before, right? It depends on who has the bullhorn. Depends on who has the megaphone.
That's one
now
thing.
We just need to ensure that the good and wise philosopher king keeps the megaphone and build the Republic of Plato.
You see how that went?
Yes.
That's one thing.
Yes.
And that's one thing, right? So everybody was a philosopher king, God forbid, because then we would probably get nowhere, but be that as it may. The other issue is, of course, that although we all have access to the information superhighway, and we all have access, we all have a bullhorn, just because we all have a bullhorn does not entail that everybody can allocate the same amount of attention. So the story is usually this, namely that since everybody has access to the social media and to the internet and whatnot, then information has become democratized somehow, or knowledge has become democratized.
That's a positive word still.
Yeah, if that was really true, because the precondition for that would be that attention allocation follows a normal distribution, insofar as to say that the bulk of us have more or less the same possibility of allocating other people's attention. That is not the case.
Oh, very nice. Okay, yeah.
That is not the case.
Expound on that.
That's not the case, because allocation of other people's attention on the web does not follow a normal distribution such that the bulk of us have more or less the same possibility of allocating other people's attention.
I guess it's a power law.
It's a power law. It's a strong power law. So if you look
Can we measure this? I mean, I understand what this means.
This has been measured more than once. I mean, there are a couple of books out there. There's The Myth of Digital Democracy. There's a couple of books that have been looking into this. And
I guess we need to explain power law first. So.
It basically means that if you look at so allocation on the y-axis and numbers of persons on the x-axis, it turns out that there's a couple of players, not many, that basically sit with every, or most of the bulk of allocation or the bulk of attention, and then everybody has to fight for whatever is left out in the tail of this particular distribution.
So it's a curve that falls downwards very, very quickly and then peters out and is almost flat. So most people are at the tail and very few are at the, whatever the opposite of a tail is, at the peak.
At the peak, right? And so basically, if you look at the big attention merchant allocators on social media platforms, you can name them easily, right? So that will be Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and as a search engine, Google. Those 4 or 5 players sit with the bulk of the traffic online.
And they have the editorial power over allocating the attention.
Exactly.
They don't produce that much information, but that doesn't really make a difference.
Doesn't make a difference.
Because
but in the meantime, they're allocating people's attention, right? And there are very few players who are basically sitting with the bulk of the traffic, and everybody else had to fight for whatever is left out there in the tail of this particular distribution. Now, that has nothing to do with everybody potentially allocating the same amount of information or allocating the same amount of attention. Some attention merchants have a lot more pull than everybody else. Yes. All right, and it tends to be such that the big get even bigger, and everybody else doesn't stand a chance. It's like with the global economic situation. 1% or 50% of all ads, and then the 99 have to fight for whatever the remaining 50%. So,
and that was actually, I guess, predicted by a simple model called preferential attachment or something. That a power law would be the logical consequence of having a distributed, many agents individually allocating their attention. Then a power law is the expected result, and you say that we can also measure this.
That's exactly what happens. And on top of that, of course, the big tend to get bigger, so you could also see that in practice, like Facebook buys Instagram, Google buys YouTube, and so the ones who actually already have a lot get even more. And so this actually happens on the macroscopic level, but it's also the same on user level. So some individual users have a lot of pull. I mean, they have a lot of it. They are allocating a lot of attention.
PewDiePie.
Huh?
PewDiePie.
For instance.
I know all I know about social media. I know through my children.
Well, there you go. So if I ask you, who is the one with the most followers on all social media platforms?
I would guess PewDiePie. That's certainly true for YouTube. I have no idea about Twitter, for instance.
If you take Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, and the others, the ones who have the person on this planet who have most followers on social media.
Tell me, I have no idea. Trump.
Taylor Swift.
Taylor Swift.
Taylor Swift.
I don't even know if I would have preferred Trump as an answer.
Well, Trump is way down there. He's much further down on the tail. But of course, but Taylor Swift, right? So, and Cristiano Ronaldo is number 2. And then I forget exactly, but then Katy Perry, Rihanna, and a third person.
And these are musicians and soccer players.
Yeah, musicians and soccer players. They basically they're allocating
football players for our European audience.
Exactly. So they are basically allocating huge amounts of attention, and everybody else has to fight for whatever is left out in the tail. So if you look at it from that perspective, if you look at the entertainment industry, you have this power distribution. If you look at it in politics, you'll have a similar power distribution. And so just because you have a bullhorn doesn't mean that you're getting heard. And of course, one who was very good at playing this particular game, because there is then no such thing as bad publicity. There is something called allocation attention. And that seems to be the currency of the Trump campaign, namely that you could send out tweets which didn't necessarily have to be true, but in the meantime, you allocated people's attention. And there's a very, very interesting new study that just came out at the start of March 2017 that went to show, Columbia Journalism Review, that went to show, they said, look, it might be such that fake news and Russian hacking had something to do with the US election, but it turns out to be the case that they did a very detailed study that the alt-right press, and not necessarily established press, but starting around Breitbart, they were actually able to create a closed ecosystem that spoke to the Trumpian electorate while they were actually setting the agenda for the mass media, right? So you had to worry about Hillary Clinton's emails, scandals about this and that, etc., and they were actually able to proliferate that particular information out into the broader media picture, such that CNN, ABC, MSNBC, whatever, actually had to take a lot of their agenda. And the interesting thing about it was that Breitbart wasn't just feeding people fake news. And the reason for that is that the winning strategy is not just to feed people a falsity. What you want to do is you want to mix truth and falsity in a proper cocktail, such that on one hand, that you can actually take your political position and hang it on some hook which is fact. And then narratives and partisanship will take care of the rest. So even if it turned out that some of the information that you get is false, you still have some truth to pin your political position on, and then your partisanship, and what Breitbart and the rest of this closed ecosystem were very good at feeding people were coherent world pictures, right? So if it is true that that when you hacked John Podestra's email, so the campaign manager of Hillary Clinton, and there was this talk about pizza, right? Pizzagate. Then at least there was talk about pizza, so that much is true. And then conspiracy theory and coherent narratives and partisanship will all of a sudden create hashtag Pizzagate, which basically was a falsehood, at least for the most part of it, but there was still some truth to some of it.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's basically a winning strategy, not to feed people just the completely false narratives, but feed them something which is true in part, and then let coherent world pictures and partisanship take care of the rest for people to swing them.
But what else should they have done? They were up against basically an old school monopoly of attention grabbing from the established media. So the only thing that can happen, conspiracy or not, I mean, it's not even necessary to have an orchestrated campaign for doing this. Let me put this. Why is this not a beautiful story, right? The only reason for this not being a beautiful story, I guess, is that you and I lost, because when
I tell you why it's not a beautiful story, because ever since the Enlightenment that you were alluding to before, we are assuming that even though we are suckers for truth, because why are we suckers for truth? Because truth and truthful information is the best basis that we know of for deliberation, decision, and action. And if we assume that we want to be rational and that we are rational to a certain extent, then fake news and false information is not the best basis on which you're going to place your decisions.
No, but nobody would agree to that. So that's sort of a vacuous. I mean, nobody would say
sure,
that.
But the problem is that there was a lot of misinformation, fake news, shitstorms and Twitter stories that had no truth to them or very little, that actually turned out to be pretty influential both in the election of Brexit, both in the Brexit campaign and in the Trump campaign. And let me tell you one more thing. You know, again, back to the Enlightenment. Now, our understanding of democracy, right, of modern democracy, is sort of born out of the Enlightenment age. Of course, you can say that back in ancient Greek, they had a kind of democracy, but then again, it really wasn't,
it's
because
just one generation. It's very short, and then
it was very short. One, and two, it was only elderly men who could vote. No women, no children, no slaves. So it had really very little. It was more like an oligarchy, if anything.
Absolutely.
So what I'm saying is that out of the Enlightenment, we get this idea that if you give people more information, also riding on the backdrop of the Dark Middle Ages, set information free and people will make better decisions, everything else being equal. Now, the consequence that we have of the information age is you have information in abundance. And the question is then, how do you get people to read the kind of information and thereby allocate their attention to things that you find either politically opportune and whatnot? Just to say that even Francis Bacon said that knowledge in and by itself is power. Today, information in and by itself is power, but the difference is between now and Bacon is that information doesn't have to be true.
Absolutely, no,
but it's still power. So just to say that one of the paradoxes of the information age is on one hand we have information in abundance. And information in abundance should actually, in principle, lead people to make better decisions, assuming that they can curate the information properly. The problem is, in the meantime, that it's very hard to curate very big chunks of information. What we usually do is we'll read the sources that are in agreement with our political inclinations up front, independently. And that only leads to more polarization. And one of the things that we do know about Western democracies is that they're acutely sensitive to extreme polarization, because that will lead from everything from radicalism on one hand to terrorism on the other.
It's completely consistent with our moral psychology. This is exactly how we humans are. We are inherently tribal.
Right.
And
you can stimulate that tribalism severely.
Yeah. So that's something that I would like to understand better. Right? It seems that the tribality that is built into the tribalism that's built into our moral psychology for probably very good evolutionary reasons seems to have now suddenly found its sort of the perfect storm of dissemination through the internet. And this is something I don't really know what to do about. But I want to push back just once on the narrative, because on the fake news narrative, because it's something I would very much like to believe. On the other hand, I'm constantly skeptical of my own biases. So the fact that we're right now explaining the fake news narrative with an example that so narrowly tracks our own ideological biases, in the sense that this is, the only reason Trump can have won is by an orchestrated campaign of fake news, possibly with an involvement of Putin. That sounds so self-serving.
No, I agree with that.
That flatters our own preconceptions so much that
I think that's too simplistic a picture. Okay.
Fine.
It's way too simplistic. Fine. Fake news is just one. What should we say, tool that you can use for information manipulation. And it's all the way out there in the tail where if fake news, if it is, you have to read it accordingly, it's basically false.
Yeah.
And
everybody seems to know that. Right?
Everybody in between that and truth, right? So there's fake news and falsity in one hand, then there's truth in the other.
Yes.
And between there's a whole continuum of various tools that you could use. You could frame the information in particular ways. You could take opportune facts and use them and forget about the rest. You can use polarization mechanisms, so people will only look at this echo chambering information. There's a million different ways in which you can manipulate with information in various degrees of truth or falsity, mixing truth and falsity. And also by basically tapping into, and those are the things that we are studying very intensively at the Center for Information and Bubble Studies, phenomena like polarization, echo chambering, bandwagon effects, lemming effects, cascading effects, and all those information-born or information-driven social psychological phenomena that will swing people in one way or the other. So there's a whole continuum of ways in which you can use information, mixing truth and falsity, and get people to run along with it in various different strategies that you can impose for getting people to swing one way or the other. Yes. So that's more of the picture. We just look at an information part, and then build on top of that. You can talk about different demographics. Some are rich, some are poor, some are elite, some are not, etc. There's a very complex mosaic that feeds into the reason why Trump was elected president, the reason why the UK left Brexit, the reason why populism is on the rise in Europe, etc., etc. And we are just looking at some of these. And
I see.
Good. And the opinion bubbles that comes along with it.
Fine, but because even the cognitively very limited toolbox of, say, Marxism suffices to explain Trump, or would have sufficed to explain Sanders.
Right.
Okay, good.
So basically
this is just
what we are looking at we are looking at the nuts and bolts of these information-driven phenomena that in many ways are responsible for some of the action, deliberation, decision that we use on a daily basis, everything from deciding which chest freezer to have next to who should be in the office in the White House.
And what I found really useful is already this idea that it's actually not the content of the fake news that's interesting, it's the fact that the fake news in itself grabs attention.
That's right.
Because that's the currency that we want to.
That's the currency, right? And so, and again, if you look at the developmental trajectory of Twitter storms, say, then usually they go like this, and then they're silent.
Yes.
Okay. Now, what you can use fake news for, and so you go like this, right? So the area under that particular curve is an expression of how much attention you have allocated.
And it's a very narrow peak.
It's a very narrow peak. Now, what you can use fake news for is to extend the peaks afterwards, right? So you can use fake news to write on the back of the Pizzagate story, to write on the back on the various stories, just to say that that on the backdrop of a Twitter storm, you can actually feed the chamber more information and allocate more attention that way around. So that's just one. But it doesn't necessarily have to be fake news. It could also be a truth.
It could even be true news.
Right. So it's just to say that there are various different ways in which you can allocate people's attention. Sometimes with fake news, sometimes with truth, sometimes with framing, sometimes with this, sometimes with that.
Okay, thank you. I want to talk about what we can do in just a minute, but just before we get there, one other pet topic for me. So we on the, what should we call this, academic left have in some sense been really good for the last 100 years to sort of remove ourselves from the idea of truth to be something of value, right? There's an entire school from Kant via Adorno, Marcuse, lots of French guys, and maybe ending in Rorty that removed the mode of discourse of several disciplines in the academia from a focus on stuffy Enlightenment values that you and I seem to represent.
That's true.
Is this our fault?
Well, I mean, look, if you had asked Kant, Rousseau, and the rest of the Enlightenment company what would happen if you gave people more information, and the result would be that they would be more navel-gazing, that they would be more polarized than probably we have seen in a long time, that status economics is on the rise, that attention economics is on the rise, then maybe they would have dreamt themselves back to the dark Middle Ages that they were to use information to actually leave, right?
I'm more concerned with telling I don't know, Foucault or Derrida that there will actually, one generation from now, there will be somebody who takes the idea that truth doesn't exist, there's only narrative, and actually wins an election using your tools. Because people who are not cognitively disciplined or intellectually honest will be much better at wielding tools of misinformation.
Yeah, but you know, I can see where you go with that. I have to say though, I don't really buy that premise, and the reason is that it's not like somebody like Trump or Nigel Farage, et cetera, just don't say that there is no such thing as truth. That's not what they're saying, but they cherry pick what they'll use. So it's not like they are saying, well, you know, they're not like they're saying there is no such thing as truth, so I can tell people whatever. No, that's not the case. But rather what they would be saying is to say, look, I'm going to cherry pick the facts so they'll fit my narrative and and sell people a coherent picture of the world, in part based on truth, in part based on falsity, but at least I'm selling a coherent story, okay? And so it's not radical skepticism. And Trump is not a radical skepticism. Nigel Farage isn't radical skepticism. He might not even be a relativist by any reasonable means either. He's just cherry picking the facts to his political agenda and opportune for his political narrative. That's what he's doing. And so it's not either or. I mean, realize, of course, if you're a radical skepticist, it would be pretty hard to sit here having this conversation.
That's what I would say to the radical skeptics, in particular because technology makes this all work.
So there you have it, right? So there is a limit as to how much you can do in terms of getting reliable inquiry off the ground if you buy into radical skepticism. The same goes for radical relativism, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay.
And in between complete truth and complete falsity and interpretations and whatnot, even Donald Trump would agree to the fact that if he's sitting at the White House in the Oval Office, he's probably sitting there. He's not being fooled by the Cartesian demon, no?
Very nice. Yes, actually, he may never have read Foucault or Derrida
or Descartes for that matter. You know.
So. Okay. Very good. So let's leave. Politics is cheap. So let's leave that and try to see what we can actually do about this. So are there ways we can? So being now aware of the fact that the way we as individuals and as groups and as nations and societies and institutions curate our information diet. Let's just assume that as a given now, and this has consequences. Right. So let's assume that as a given. What can we do? Can we become operational or practical?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And that's one of the things that we are looking into at the center, obviously. But the way in which we're doing that is to say, okay, let's take some of the social-psychological phenomena that we know of are actually sometimes derailing our rationality, right? So that could be pluralistic ignorance, majority mistakes. So I don't believe that phi, but I wrongfully believe that everybody else or the majority believes not phi.
Tell us about common knowledge and pluralistic ignorance.
So usually when we deliberate, decide, and act in concert with others, a very good basis for that would be what is common knowledge between us, right? So not only that I know P, and I know that you know P, and you know that I know P, that I know that you know P, that you know that I know, right? So on every infinite level, there's complete transparency as to what we know between us.
I know something, and I also know that you know the same thing.
And vice versa. And then for every other level, as far as you want to go, we can keep swapping what we know and what's common knowledge between us.
Right.
So that's extremely important if you have to coordinate, right?
So this is common knowledge, and that's not the same as, what is it, mutual knowledge?
Mutual knowledge is the same thing. So it's a different thing, right? So mutual knowledge means that I know P and that you know P, but not that I know that you know that you know that I know.
So can we find an example? I know that the earth is round, and I assume you know the same thing.
But unless we talked about it, we might not, unless of course now.
But isn't that common knowledge? Can't I assume that you know that the
Well,
earth is round?
I mean, we might have to establish it, right? So there would be things that could be other things, right? So
just given what I know about your education.
Look, so I might know that there are 12 million people in New York City.
Yeah, I don't know that.
You might also know that, suppose, or take Berlin.
Fine.
Or any city that we apparently know, but we might not know. I might not know that you know it, nor that you know that I know it.
And that is mutual knowledge.
That's mutual knowledge.
Roundness of the earth is common knowledge.
Right.
Population
that would be probably common knowledge by now, right?
Yes, population of New York might be mutual knowledge.
Yeah, that's
I
right.
certainly can't assume that you know it.
No, exactly.
Thank you.
Although I might know and you might know separately, okay?
Good. Absolutely.
And then of course there's distributed knowledge, right? Where the knowledge of a proposition is sort of pieced together by different things. So that's like wisdom of crowds type of thing is the extreme example of distributed knowledge.
So
right?
you and I might together be able to piece together.
We might be wiser than the one that each one of us are singularly.
We might be able to piece together all the 11 players on some particularly important football team.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly.
That is distributed knowledge.
Yeah. So we're piecing it together, but we don't know the complete set of players, either one of us. But together we will know both.
Good.
All right. So that's distributed knowledge, right? And common knowledge is very nice because common knowledge is a very good basis to coordinate. It's going to be hard at a traffic light if it's not common knowledge among us that red means stop, right?
Good.
Fine. So common knowledge is usually a very, very important tool for us when we have to talk about norms, when we have to talk about behavioral patterns, et cetera, et cetera.
Society building.
Society building is based in no small part on what we take common knowledge to be. Okay. Now there is an evil cousin to common knowledge. That evil cousin is called pluralistic ignorance.
Very nice.
And pluralistic ignorance basically means that I believe something, but I wrongfully believe that either everybody else or the majority of everybody else believes something else. So let me give you an example. We just did a big survey along with the Danish Children's Council pertaining to people's attitudes, or 15-year-old people's attitudes towards cyberbullying. Okay. Now, if you're a perpetrator or a victim perpetrator, then you don't think yourself that it's okay to cyberbully. But you wrongfully believe that your classmates, and in particular your friends, are much more acceptable towards cyberbullying than you are yourself.
You think that as a victim or as a perpetrator?
Well, if you are talking about being a victim or victim perpetrator, right? Or excuse me, if you're talking about being, you have been a victim of cyberbullying, then you don't. But if you're a perpetrator or a victim perpetrator, right?
What is a victim perpetrator?
That's one who's been the victim of cyberbullying, but also conducted it.
I see.
As opposed to just one who's perpetrated it.
Good.
Now, clearly, the victims don't think it's cool in either way.
Nope.
But victim perpetrators, so the conjunction victim and perpetrator, and perpetrators, there seems to be a robust pattern that they don't think it's okay to cyberbully themselves, but they wrongfully believe that the majority of their friends and classmates think it's much more okay than it is that they find it themselves.
So everybody else thinks P, I know not P.
Yeah, or believe not P. You don't have to know it, but believe, right?
Yeah.
So you believe that P, and you believe that everybody different from yourself believes not P.
And that is pluralistic ignorance.
That's called pluralistic ignorance.
It's a false,
It's a majority mistake.
It's a majority mistake.
It's basically a majority mistake. And majority mistakes are nasty because you can coordinate on majority mistakes also, because you believe something and you wrongfully believe that everybody else believes something else. And so basically what you can get out of this whole business is that you can get people to collectively to subscribe to a norm that they privately reject.
Ah, beautiful. Yes.
Very, very disconcerting phenomenon.
Absolutely.
And the basic idea is that you have a wrong idea of the distribution of standpoints in your group or in your immediate surroundings. So you believe that they believe something else than you believe.
So elections seem to be very good control mechanisms for that.
For instance, right? So elections seem to be good control mechanisms for it, but of course also that it's a massive tool for manipulation. And let me give you an example of that. So I teach logic. And I
good old-fashioned that, like I know it,
right,
with Muse and Sigmas and
everything.
Colons.
Right?
Great.
And so I teach Mondays and Wednesdays. So Monday I might give my students a homework assignment for them to solve for Wednesday, right? Okay, that happens. Now come Wednesday, I'm not really interested in, going through that exercise. But of course, if I tell them we're not going to go through the exercise, we're just going to continue, there's a lot of sunk cost for them because they use Monday afternoon and Tuesday to try to solve this problem. And come Wednesday, I don't want to go through it with them, right? So if I tell them that, they're probably going to get angry. But I can manipulate them to give me the right answer. Namely, I'll ask my students, what do you think was difficult with Monday's exercise? And you know how they react? Precisely as you do now. Because in the very way I frame the question, I'm saying it was difficult. So if I'm in doubt as to whether or not I got it right, and I don't have more information that was on my sheet of paper, then what I will do is I will look at my friend next to me, discreetly see what my friend has been saying. But if my friend is as doubtful as to whether they got it right or not, they're not going to flag that they didn't know it. They're basically going to say nothing. So I receive a signal from them that they didn't have a problem, because otherwise they would have said. And then all of a sudden you get this pluralistic ignorance to go through the entire class. Everybody thought it was extremely difficult, but they wrongfully believed that everybody else believed that it wasn't because they didn't flag their hands. And then I look over and people will go, oh, nobody had problems with yesterday's exercise, I'll just continue.
So you correctly infer that I never did my logic homework when I was a bachelor student.
Well, you could say
yes,
that.
yes.
Right. Okay, so what's the problem? The problem is the signal that is tacitly being elicited by every student, namely that since they don't say anything, you conclude that they didn't have a problem. And so basically the problem is that I'm asking my students to orientate themselves towards each other before they answer the question. Now, if I just remove the act of orientation, so they don't force to look at each other, then I will say, well, if nobody seems to have any problems, I'll just say, okay, nobody had problems yesterday, let's just continue. Now, if I want my students to give an answer, I'll frame the question differently. I'll say, what do you think other previous students had for problems with yesterday's exercise? And then all of a sudden it doesn't concern them, so they don't have to look at each other, they don't need this, they're not getting the signals, and then everybody will go, I thought that this particular thing, or other students would have thought such and so. You understand what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
So basically, you can manipulate using pluralistic ignorance, or get it to spread or not to spread.
Yes.
And so it's an extremely powerful mean, and if you can get everybody to believe that a certain norm is the one to follow, even if everybody singularly believes that it's not, you got yourself a very potential game. Now, you were asking about what do you do about it?
Yes.
What turns out to be the case is that if you tell people you cannot cyberbully or you cannot drink, that's not going to happen. Paternalism doesn't work. So what you'll do instead, and what turns out to work, is if you inform people of the structure and the dynamics of some of these social psychological phenomena, then that in and by itself might be a preventive measure for them to fall into a majority mistake another time. So what we're basically doing is to understand the mathematics of these social psychological phenomena as a basis for prevention strategies or intervention strategies for people not to fall in again. That goes in the analog world, and it certainly also works in the digital world.
This is a topic that I just discovered a few years ago, social psychology. It's immensely fascinating.
Right, and it's amenable to everything from mathematics to computer implementations.
Yes, absolutely.
So that's what we're doing
stuff.
at the center. And all this feeds into either bursting bubbles or preventing them from happening, whether we're talking opinion bubbles on one hand or political status bubbles, etc. on the other.
I guess we need to mention the filter bubble, which in some sense placed some of this in the digital world. In 2011, there's a famous book by Eli Pariser.
Eli Pariser, yes. And it certainly did take, it did allocate a lot of attention, and for good reason. However, Studies tend to show, though, that it's less a pronounced phenomenon than what people think.
That's what I wanted to hear. I've been evangelizing about this myself in 2011 and 12, and then I sort of became a bit tired of it because it seemed to be not as dramatic as I wanted it to make out to be.
There's studies that tend to show that it's not quite as pronounced as what one would think.
But maybe only because we're aware of it. I don't know. I mean, I've been evangelizing about algorithms for many years, and then suddenly there was this single issue which spread like wildfire, and everybody, because journalists were concerned about this, so suddenly you have this platform and could talk about it, and that was quite an experience. And now everybody knows. So when I talk many years ago, when I talked to people and said I do algorithms, they had a difficult time on distinguishing an algorithm from a logarithm. But today everybody falsely knows, that I'm the one curating the Facebook feed. Algorithms today means basically nefarious news curation.
Speaking of which, as you know, that Facebook just will be launching, pertaining to the German election coming up, an app for your news feed. So if you get in your news feed a piece of information, you go, could that possibly be true? You can flag it, and they'll send it back to Facebook, and they will have PolitiFact and other fact-checking institutions check whether or not it is so, and then throw it back into your news feed with, say, a disclaimer going disputable if they couldn't verify it. So just to say that, and this is an important fact. Now, information is a source for enlightenment, but it has to be curated. If you set it free,
by whom?
Yeah, but that's the issue.
Except for you and me, right? The only person I trust to curate this is myself, and possibly you, since you now send so many virtue signals to me about being a logician.
Just so we can sit in our echo chamber together, right?
Yes, that's what we are.
So just to say that even the big players in the field are aware now that some sort of curation of information is required, because if you just assume a market fundamentalistic model of information, then you're going to get into these nasty issues of power laws, your fake news, allocation, attention, et cetera, which does ever so often derail or otherwise pretty rational mind.
Absolutely. I would be very surprised if Facebook got this right, because this is a thousands-year-old problem, right?
I agree.
So it would be very strange if the first attempt to do this would work, and I assume this will take a generation or something like that.
And while you're at it, realize one more thing. Facebook wants to get back into the Chinese market. In 2009 they were in 2009 they were barred, But of course the Chinese are saying, well, we might want to do that, but then again we want to be able to control the news feed. So there you have it. So on one end, but you have to realize one more thing though about all this, that there is the other narrative that goes along is that everybody has access, everything has become more democratic. Now we already showed that that's not quite the case, right? Because you have to realize that if you look at the big players in attention economics online, it doesn't say anywhere that they have to stimulate democracy.
No, absolutely not.
It's not part of the business model. No. So you can of course say that they should, but it's not part of their game necessarily.
Is this just history repeating? Because newspapers were intensely partisan and just lied through their teeth 100 years ago. Nobody would assume that newspapers are supposed to be reliable sources of information, and then there was a pretty big movement where some kind of journalistic ethics was developed, and maybe this was a success or not, I don't know, but certainly the self-conceptualization of what a newspaper editorial is changed completely during the last century. So is something like that going to happen as well, or not, because there is no monopoly, there is no institution that actually provides the information?
That's probably what's going to happen, but what is still the case, that for every claim there's got to be checks and balances.
Yes. Oh, thank you. That's exactly how I think about this, right? It's really not about controlling the person who puts the information in the memetic space. It's about having checks and balances that then react to the inevitable false information that is going to spread through it. So,
exactly.
So now
and that means that for every user, checks and balances on every statement. So in many ways, it also starts with ourselves, So and the reason is basically that everything else being equal, if I have to deliberate, decide, and act, I want information that I take to be pretty much as close to the truth as we can get. First, or if not truth, then probable, or possible, or reasonable, etc. And so from that perspective, information is acutely important to us in our daily workings. And it's not going to be any less.
No.
But we're still going to have to do checks and balances on it.
Is the model of liberal democracy and the public sphere, Öffentlichkeit in Habermas, is that just dead now? Is there no longer a single public sphere, or can we update that model?
There are multiple public spheres.
There are multiple public
I have a
spheres
PhD
that
student
interact in various ways, and access to these spheres is now mediated by lots of different actors and ourselves.
Sure, and that means that the entire sort of what you would call information market has become severely more complex than we have seen ever before. With the possibilities that brings along, but of course also with disadvantages that brings along.
Absolutely.
As well.
Which we are
and we
aware
have
of.
to realize though that we are in the middle of this big social and informational experiment, right? I mean, it's only what so it's 13 years ago since we got Facebook, and maybe 20 years, 25 years ago since we got the web.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a very new experience.
What a
So
time
we
to
are
be
in
alive.
the middle
Yes,
of it.
absolutely.
We're in the midst of trying to figure out exactly how we're going to behave in this new world.
But there is grounds for moderate optimism for liberal democracy.
Yeah, certainly. But of course we have to work at it every day. It's not a law of nature that we got it.
So this was one of the aspects of democracy and information technology, namely access to the public sphere. Next week I hope I can talk to Carsten Schürmann about digital elections and that aspect of democracy. Vincent, thanks a lot for coming. This was great. I learned a lot. Bye.
Thanks for having me.